Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brenda Gunn. I'm the Academic and Research Director here at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and I am pleased to welcome you all to our Truth and Reconciliation Week programming. We have a series of adult or general public lunch and learn series this year that we're adding to the program. Today, day one, we're talking about Indigenous peoples and the history of residential schools. I'm so pleased that we have two amazing guests joining us today. We have Crystal Fraser and Maata Palmer, who are joining us to share their knowledge and experiences around residential schools. Our program today is available in French interpretation, as well as with ASL interpretation. Just before we get started, I do want to remind everyone that the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line provides 24-hour crisis support to former residential school students and their families. That can be reached toll-free at 1-866-925-4419, and we'll place this information in the chat as well. There's also the Hope for Wellness helpline, which is available 24 hours to all Indigenous peoples across Canada and can be accessed by phone at 1-855-242-3310 or online at chat from their website, hopeforwellness.ca. So today we're going to have a conversation about Indigenous peoples and residential schools. I'm going to start by asking our panelists a couple of questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience to share their questions through the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen. We were hoping to broadcast today's session live, but it will, technical glitch may not be able to happen, but we will put it on our YouTube channel at the completion. And so it will be available to those who want to join us and watch it afterwards there. So without much further ado, I'd like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Maata, can I start with you, please? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Brenda. Hello, everyone. My name is Maata Palmer. I'm Inuk. I was born just outside of a place called Igloolik when my parents were traveling by dog team. My dad always said that I was born on sea ice, not actual sea, but frozen ice. It was before medical facilities were ever open in our area in Nunavut. And I grew up outside of a place called Pont Inlet, our traditional land. I was there until the government relocated my family to a place called Frobisher Bay in 1959. I remember that day. It was beginning of September. The ground was already covered with snow when we landed in a place called Frobisher Bay. And then they drove us to a little community called Apex Hill. It was a transition camp for Inuit to be integrated into the main society. Our parents had to learn how to use money, how to buy food from the store. We had to learn to eat store-bought food. it was a very difficult period. I had already, or my parents had already lost 3 children to residential school by this time. And we didn't see those siblings for a long time until the following year in 1960, when they came to spend summer with us. We lost one brother because he was not, I don't know if it was because he was not familiar with going out on the land or because there was trouble with the boat. I'm not sure. I was too young to understand that, but I know it's etched in my memory that we lost this brother who was very lively, happy-go-lucky young man. And we barely knew him because he was away at residential school all this time. So my family was affected by colonization, I guess. When the government moved us to that place that we didn't know any. My parents didn't know the land. My dad was didn't have hunting tools. The language that we are used to was different from theirs. So there was all kinds of obstacles right from the beginning. And then in the fall, I think it was the following year, 1960, when I started school. And the teachers, it seems like the teachers expected us to understand what they were saying, without realizing that we were not supposed to talk our language. We, of course, being kids, we spoke and we got punished for it. Many of us spent many times in the hallways because we spoke our language. And we got hit with a ruler on our hands, on the palm of our hands, and also on the back of our hands. When we went home from school to tell our parents what had happened, they told us what we learned in school, the language we learned in school, we only speak it at the school, not at home. Because my parents didn't know any other language other than Inuktitut. That's how my dad made sure that we speak our language at home. So I'm forever grateful for that because I kept my language. I think most of us younger children of my parents, we kept our language because our dad was very firm that we speak it at home. We speak Inuktitut at home. That was the beginning of, it was like you are going into your training, you're being trained before you go to actual residential school, because what's going to happen there? I didn't know that. Yeah. Anyways, I'm sorry for going on and on and on. I have been in Manitoba since 1980. I moved to Churchill. I worked there as an interpreter translator at the hospital. I also did many other jobs that I could get. So I had to feed my family. And then I moved to Thompson, Manitoba, where I met my husband. He was a weatherman, and we settled there for 16 years, and I was a member of YWCA Board of Directors there for a couple of years. That's how I started my volunteer work. And I also trained as an office manager. Even though I felt really insecure, not really knowing how to speak English and write it or read it, I tried really, really hard to learn those things, and I landed an office management job, and I stayed there for 9 years. And while I was there, I was also on the Manitoba Midwifery Council when they first started talking about midwifery. And when they first started talking about residential school, it was almost like we never spoke of it before. This man, his name was Phil Fontaine. He spoke on the national news about his experience. He opened the door for us to share our experience with other people. Some it was a good thing, and for some it was not so good. It was something that had been that's how my sharing started. And then when we moved down south to Winnipeg, I became a member of Manitoba Inuit Association, was on the board of directors for a couple of years. When my husband got ill, I just stayed home to look after him. And after he passed away, a friend of mine had put my name in for a survivors circle at National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And that's how I came to being here. Sometimes it's difficult to share what I have to share, but I always feel that people have to know, because for too long, they thought we were just making it up, that it never actually happened. But for those of us who went to residential school, it's real. We live with it all the time. Some of us have learned to adjust who we are, because we cannot let it control our emotions and the way we are. So that's what I want to share today. I have a lot more to say, but when they start asking questions, maybe something else will come up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maata, for sharing some of your story, and we will come back and ask a few more questions. Crystal, we'd love to get to know you a little bit more. Can you introduce yourself, please, and how you came to work on and learn the history of some of the residential school experiences in the North?
Absolutely. Well, Dringweenzi Shellac, Shori Crystal Gale Fraser Vilji, Anuvik at Dachan Shoganjik, Gwitsat Gwitcha Gwitchin Ithli. So hi, friends and family. My name is Crystal Gale Fraser. I'm Gwitcha Gwitchin, but also of Scottish ancestry, originally from Anuvik, Northwest Territories, and my family's fish camp on the Mackenzie River in Dechancho Ganjik, or it's also called Tree River in English. I come to you today from beautiful Treaty 6, homeland of the Métis Nation, just outside of Edmonton. I am an assistant professor in history and Indigenous studies at the University of Alberta. I am also on the governing circle for the National Centre of Truth and Reconciliation, and I'm a founding member of the National Advisory Committee on Missing Residential School Children and Unmarked Burials. You know, I come to this work as an intergenerational survivor. I have never been institutionalized as at a residential school. My grandmother was institutionalized at Immaculate Conception Indian Residential School in Aklavik, Northwest Territories in the 1940s and the 50s. And then my mother at Grolier Hall in Anuvik. That would have been in the 1960s, early 1970s. And I lived right across the street from Grolier Hall. It was one of the final institutions that closed in 1996, and also would have been at Grolier if I had lived in one of the smaller outlying communities. So a lot of friends and family members, you know, I find sometimes there's this misconception that residential schools, that experience only relates to older people or elders. But as somebody in my early 40s, I have younger cousins who were institutionalized. So definitely still something that young people can grapple with as direct survivors. I didn't know a lot about residential schools until I started university. I had a lot of questions growing up in Anuvik, mostly in relation to my own family, you know, high rates of substance abuse, of incarceration, of disruption, yet, you know, this innate connection to land and going to fish camp and having attended Sir Alexander Mackenzie School, that was recognized as one of the Indian day schools, and you know, having language lessons in Inuvialuktun and in Gwich'in being available to me. And so I think we're going to get to how the North may have been different from Southern institutions. But that is where I grew up and where I come from. But we didn't talk about residential schools. And so all of the learning that I've done about these institutions have come in my 30s and 40s. I started university a little bit later, and you know, exploring what that looks like, and you know, bearing witness to the TRC and to these conversations becoming more common in our communities, and trying to support survivors in going through this very public experience. And, you know, also focusing on cultural continuity and language revitalization and oral histories and storytelling and tradition. So for my PhD, that was one thing I did, was interviews with survivors and knowledge keepers, and that work is forthcoming with the University of Manitoba Press. It's called By Strength, We Are Still Here. But I really look forward to sharing with you all today about my experiences, not only as a historian of residential schools, as an intergenerational survivor, but also as somebody who has, you know, commented extensively in the media on unmarked graves and missing children, but also about reconciliation. A few years ago, I co-authored 150 Acts of Reconciliation, which you can find on activehistory.ca. And so it's been exciting to be part of those conversations and working so closely with the NCTR. Thanks, Brenda.
Right. There we go. Thank you so much, Crystal. I want to circle back around to one of your comments, Crystal, and that is when you were speaking and introducing yourself, you referred to residential schools as institutions. And so maybe you can sort of explain that. But before I jump to that, I'm monitoring the chat and I'm noticing some people are a little confused as to the setup. And so I just want to share that while this is a Zoom meeting, it's what we call a Zoom webinar. So so the audience can't see one another and interact. All you see are the panelists. And this is a privacy setting because this is a public event. So you will only see the people on screen who our tech support has put up. So you can see the panelists, myself, and our ASL interpreter. And so that's why you're not seeing one another right now, because we do have over 3,000 participants. And so we do see your questions coming in and we will get to them. But Crystal, I want to come back to this use of the word institution and not school. Can you maybe share a little bit about that word choice? Because I think it's important for people to understand.
For sure. And I'm very careful with language that I use. I think language is important and it matters how we describe these institutions. And so the formal title, like the way that that our ancestors in Canadian government and settlers referred to these places were Indian residential schools or residential schools. That was the official terminology. Sometimes they played with that language. They tried boarding schools and other phrases, but they called them schools. But in recent years, like especially as survivors share more of their stories, we know that these schools did not operate as schools were supposed to. They were not really about educating children. They were about the forced removal of children from their families and from their lands. And this was supported by Canadian federal legislation called the Indian Act, which, by the way, is still active today. Indigenous peoples in Canada are still legislated by the Indian Act. But you know, at this time, attendance was mandatory. Indigenous parents could be fined or imprisoned if they did not, quote unquote, allow their child to go to these institutions. And so when you asked, you know, like what how were they institutions? Very similar to prisons. And so my work as a historian has shown that some residential schools actually use the same blueprints as prisons in Canada. In the North, in particular, staff could be seconded or shared between prisons and residential schools. And so when we think about institutional life, we think about folks who maybe are there against their will. That was residential schools, who live in a highly structured, regimented way by a schedule, by not having a lot of autonomy, forced haircuts, the wearing of uniforms, the forced speaking of English. And so I say that children were institutionalized because when we say they attended a school, that seems fairly benign. It seems fairly, as though they had a choice. And I mean, it's important to emphasize also that like some, the Indian Act was sometimes not enforced. Like sometimes families did have a choice, and there were definitely Indigenous families who wanted their child educated in a Canadian way. And what they didn't bargain for was the outcome of residential schools and what happened there. So I hope that clears up some of that possible confusion. I also just want to clarify, I saw in the chat, somebody asked, what is the TRC? So that was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for clarifying that and for finding that question for us. Maata, did you want to share from your perspective why we might think of residential schools as more institutions and not sort of schools like many people may be sending children and grandchildren to today? Did you have thoughts on that?
I think I know I always thought that the school I went to was institution, but we just call it school because that's what it's classified as. They send us away so that we will learn the Canadian way, the way things are in the big centers, about how to eat their food to begin with. Like, it wasn't just about classroom sitting. Everything was to assimilate us. We had a certain time to get up. We had to get ready. We had to get our rooms cleaned and in good order. We had to put our uniforms on, and we had to line up. What we got there, it was sometimes it was forced to like we were not trained in that language, so it was very difficult to understand what was going on. And until the ruler came out, we knew we had to pay attention. We didn't. We had to be quiet and try to see what other kids are doing, making sure that we were doing the same thing. Yeah, that's total institution. And cafeteria is another thing. We had to line up. When I went to what do you call it? Buffet style restaurant first time, it was here in Brandon, and it made me think about Churchill school that I went to, because we stood in line, we picked our food, and then we went and sat down with a tray. That it makes you when that happens, it makes you, because you're trained that way, right? It stays with you. When I was done my lunch, I put all my dishes in that tray and was gonna take it back. And the people I was having lunch with, they said they'll pick it up. You know, because you're conditioned to do things like that. And so even many years after having been in school that like that, it's still ingrained in me that we have to follow someone else. That's where sometimes I think a lot of insecurity builds up. Because when you try to do things on your own, you were told you're wrong. You can't do it that way. You have to do it this way. I never been in prison, but I think I have in that way, in that sense, in an institution where everything was controlled. Even when you went to the washroom, like in the morning, you had to do certain things. You do that first, you do the other thing next, and then you get ready for school. So there's a lot of timing involved as well. One time when I went to Inuvik, that was 2011, when they had the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation had their gathering there to gather their stories. I thought I had kind of dealt with or put something in my mind, like in order, that I was okay in my heart and in my mind, until one man, when he was giving his testimony, he said it wasn't just the supervisors or the caretakers or the teachers who did bad things to students. Sometimes it was other students who had been taught, who had learned these things, that kind of triggered something in me. And how true that is. You know, that term where a human being could, if they had been traumatized so badly that they could hide in their minds that event that happened to them without realizing. I think because I was so young, my mind couldn't handle what had happened to me by another student, that I hid it for many, many years. And when that man said that, my ears started ringing. It was like I was closing my eyes. I guess I was fainting, and I didn't know what was going on. Even to this day, I don't really know the details of that incident, but I know it happened. I just know that in my being, I know that. So I hope that answers your question, Brenda. That's the best I could, the best I could describe it.
Thank you, Maata. And thank you so much for sharing. I want to keep moving along to help us understand here. You know, I've been with the NCTR 2 years now, but I've been teaching at the law school for 10 or 15 years before that. And I've really noticed a big difference in what Canadians know, especially after the identification of unmarked graves in Tagaaq and the announcement in May 2020, or 2021, sorry, I'm losing track of years. But what I've come to realize is what people know now generally are things like that residential schools existed. And they have images of these 3 or 5-story buildings and kids getting taken from their home and put there and these sort of, but I think a lot of what people know is really based on a lot of Southern experiences and maybe even prairie experiences, sort of from like the 1920s, 30s to the 60s, like that kind of period. And that's an important part of history. But part of the reason we invited Crystal and Maata here today was to help us gain a bit of a deeper understanding of different experiences at residential schools. So I'm wondering if you can both share from your perspective, what might be some of the differences if we sort of take an average experience. I don't even know how to explain that, but you know what Canadians might sort of think as residential schools and residential school experience. What are some of the differences that people should start to understand in the complexity of residential schools and residential school experiences? I don't know, Crystal, did you want to start with that? And then Maata, I can turn to you.
Sure. Well, there are many, and I mean, I agree that there is no kind of one prototype of experience at residential schools. You know, what we do know is that this system existed for over a century. That means like a big difference in experiences for Indigenous children. Sometimes a child could even have a different experience under a new principal at the same residential school. You know, it made a difference who was in charge. It made a difference if your institution was run by the Oblates and the Catholics versus the Protestant church. You know, it made a difference if you were at what they called an industrial school on the prairies, where children were forced into farming labor for 12 hours a day versus at an institution in the Arctic where farming was not something that was viable. There were other forms of labor. You know, it made a difference if you were a little boy or a little girl. I mean, we know that there was widespread violence and assaults. But we know that girls and young women were targeted in certain ways. For instance, my research at Grolier Hall shows forced monthly pelvic examinations for a certain time. The regulation of menstrual cycles and periods and pregnancies. We also know that age made a difference. And so, you know, a little child who is 4 or 5 years old, and I will say that official Indian policy said that kids needed to be 6. I have noted in my research as young as 9 months old that little babies were at residential schools. It made a difference if you were torn from your family and you were a toddler versus if you were able to stay in the bush and speak your language and hunt and trap until you were 10. So all of these things definitely made a contribution to what sort of residential school experience you had. In the North in particular, we know that as many residential schools in Southern Canada were closing during the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Brand new multi-million-dollar institutions were opening in the north. And so the big ones were in Inuvik, they were in Yellowknife, they were in, Maata mentioned Frobisher Bay, in Chesterfield Inlet. And I mean, this is complex. A part of that is because Canada was responding to the Second World War and to new challenges about Arctic sovereignty, to the US military coming into the Canadian North to test military equipment. It was linked to resource extraction and a new oil industry and pipeline interests, So this all happened after the Second World War, but it had different sorts of implications because Canadians knew about residential schools, and this is another misconception, is that settlers did not know that this was somehow happening without knowledge. But somebody in the chat mentioned like the Peter Bryce report in 1910, like the atrocities of residential schools and the genocide happening there had long been documented in Canadian newspapers, but particularly after the Holocaust, Canadians were very well aware of how they were treating what they called, our Native people. And so experiences in the North were different. The North was also quite far from Ottawa, which meant, that is a good thing and a bad thing. A good thing in the sense that these institutions were sometimes able to incorporate local customs. Kids in Inuvik were able to wear mucklucks and atadalics and furs, mostly in order to stay warm in the Arctic. But additionally, it meant that things like vaccinations for influenza and for measles and mumps and other medical supplies never made it north because it was too far, it was too remote. The relationships between the missionaries running these institutions and the federal government were not established because of distance. So those are just a couple of examples. I'm sure Maata has more.
Thank you, Crystal, that I couldn't put it in a better way. The only, I think that, so this is from stories from my cousins and my siblings, when they went to Chesterfield Inlet. I think it was middle of the 50s. 54, 53, 54, around that time. This is in the 1953, not 2053. They said that in the fall, like before the ice freeze, they would be sent off to go fishing so that they I don't know how the funding was funneled into their Chesterfield Inlet School, but to eat, they had to go fishing or go catch rabbits and ptarmigans, either on the weekends or after school. But in Churchill, where I went, it was in the 60s. So everything was brought in. We were at the Army base, Fort Churchill. That's where the school was. We had dormitories. It was not a building like the way we see pictures of 2 or 3 story buildings. It wasn't like that. It was like Army barracks. That's what we, that's how they housed us. This is when, I think after the Army left. Those dormitories were 2-story. There was upper and lower units. And the money was not as scarce as when my older siblings went to residential school, so we didn't have to go hunting to feed ourselves. That was another thing. I know the girls were in all the residential schools, the girls were and the boys didn't mix. There was no like the boys had their own dorms and the girls had their own dorms, and we had a mother, home mother, who I think, if I remember, I've only seen her. I don't know. I was too young to know if I see her every day or if we saw her once a week. I'm not sure. Yeah. We relied on each other. Older girls were like our big sisters, and some of us had language barriers because we came from different parts of the Arctic. The ones who came from northern Quebec, they spoke a little different language than we did. Like Inuktitut is not like all the same right across. Even in the Western Arctic, we have trouble understanding if we come from the east. We understand the Greenlandics better than we can other Inuit from the same country. So so that way, maybe it was a little bit different that way. I'm not sure. They also went to the boys went to industrial school, I guess, where they learned to operate heavy equipment, to become mechanics or electricians. And us girls, we were taught to work in an office, learn to type, and or keep house and learn about children, cleanliness, because they had to teach us about like sanitization, I guess, about soap. We were not used to soap. All those things were very different, or very different from our own lifestyle. So there's probably a lot more. Yeah, I can't, sometimes my memory, when you're young and you go to a place that's very different from your own environment, you get shock, you get cultural shock, and it's, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Maata. I have just looked at the time and it is already 1:21 here. So technically we're a minute past our end time. So I just want to say from the very bottom of my heart, thank you for sharing with us today. This has been a really great experience. I have learned a lot. I'm starting to learn and know a bit more about the difference of the Arctic experiences. And I also, Maata, I'm not sure if you've seen the questions, but at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A session, and a lot of love and support have been expressed to both of you for sharing your story, and Maata, a lot of comments, and I assume they're coming in more as we go through now, but I think the audience, I saw 3,000 at one point joining us today, really benefited from your knowledge and experience in helping us understand the residential school experiences in Canada from a lens that we don't always hear. So before I close today, I'm going to attempt to just, oh, Kelly, can I share screen at all? Do you know how to enable that? I forgot to ask earlier, but I did want to thank everyone for coming. We do have some discussion questions. If you're watching this in a workplace or with friends, or you want to continue having these conversations, some questions that all of you can continue to think about, and I'll throw them in the chat for everyone to see and share, to reflect on. You know, thinking about, what does this information mean to you? Where can you go? We have some information as well. Where else can you learn some additional information? I also want to remind everyone that we have 5 days of learning. So this is our opening hearing from Maata and Crystal about residential schools. Tomorrow, we're going to start learning about unconscious bias and debunking stereotypes, and how we can really understand how some of the racism continues to work in Canada and what we can start doing there. We have a conversation about intergenerational impacts and ongoing systemic discrimination. I know there were some questions about connections to Indian Act and all of those things. And so that's some of our conversations on Wednesday. Thursday, we'll start talking about Indigenous peoples' rights and laws and the UN Declaration. And then Friday, we're going to move towards reconciliation, taking action, what people can really do to do things differently. So finally, oh yes, Maata, did you have yeah.
I have a question about the question and answer. Would it be possible to send them to us? We could answer some of the questions at our time, or not? Is it only available during this Zoom time?
No, Maata, great question. Kayla is gonna see if she can save some of the questions, and as people registered, we may be able to answer. We may also talk to some of our tech team to see if there's a way that we can maybe post some stuff. So please check back to our website. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. I also just put in the chat for everyone. So at the bottom, if you open where it says chat, we have our website, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, so nctr.ca, where you can find more information about our work. And I just will say, we are so pleased to provide Canada this education. And we will graciously accept any donations through our website if people are so inclined. But it is our privilege, honor, and our mandate to share this information with Canadians. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, Crystal and Maata. And we hope all of you join us tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.